Oh my god guys, I can't believe it, Honkai Impact 3 is dead, part 2 killed it. Well, I guess it's time to stop playing. I mean, the servers are gonna close in any minute. I'm just gonna delete my channel and start a new one where I'll cover ZZZ called Bang Boo Labs. So you'll find me there. Hello, today's video is going to be more chill with less editing and just me talking, partly because I don't think this type of video requires a lot of editing and partly because I want to take a break from straining my back. So, this idea that Honkai Impact 3 is dead, or dying, has been floating around for a while. And yeah, it's true that the game has been in decline, but it's nowhere near as bad as people on the internet want it to be. I wanted to make this video to clear up some misinformation regarding things like revenue, part 2 gacha, power creep and more, and explain why this game is far from dead. In fact, we might be close to seeing it rise back to the glory sooner than you think. But first, speaking of misinformation on the internet, one of the best way to protect yourself while browsing is by using today's video sponsor, Surfshark VPN. What is a VPN, you ask? Well, a VPN is something you use to ensure that your internet data, such as your location and accounts, are completely safe. It stops hackers from identifying your IP address and protects your personal information. Surfshark achieves this by virtually changing your IP address and geolocation, which can have the added benefit of unlocking hidden content on websites such as Netflix. I use Surfshark VPN to help me watch my favorite shows and anime series that are available in my country, such as the TV series Taboo or One Piece, which is somehow missing from my country on Crunchyroll. Surfshark is super easy to install and one subscription spans across multiple devices. And that's not all. Surfshark VPN's subscription comes bundled with Surfshark Alert, which will notify you whenever any of your personal information is ever leaked online. Head to the link in the description and use code HOMULABS at checkout for up to 4 additional months for free. You can be confident in your purchase of Surfshark VPN as they offer a complete risk-free 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you so much to Surfshark for sponsoring this video and to you for checking out their product. First and foremost, let's talk about the main argument people use when claiming that the game is quote-unquote dead, which is the revenue. At the beginning of each month, people often get their data from websites like Sensor Tower and compile them into a list to see which game makes more money, which have fallen off, and to gauge how their favorite gacha game is doing. For those of you who do not know, Sensor Tower is a website that gathers data and provides an estimate revenue for different mobile apps, including gacha games. Then there are websites like gacharevenue.com which compile the data and create a list based on how much revenue a gacha game generates per server. It's important to note that Sensor Tower does not calculate how much money a game makes on PC, so all the data available is from iOS and Android. This means that all the games with a PC port probably make a lot more money, or at least some of them do. On top of that, Sensor Tower doesn't report Android revenue for Chinese servers, so to make up the chart, gacha revenue uses a 1.75 multiplier of the iOS revenue to estimate how much money the games make on Android. Note that different sources use different multipliers. For example, gacha revenue reported that Honkai Impact 3 made around $2.5 million in China last month on iOS and Android, while other sources on Bilibili, which is basically the YouTube of China, reported that the game made around 4.1 million, which is a big difference. Not to mention that both Sensor Tower and gacha revenue state clearly that the numbers take a while to stabilize and can change throughout the first week that they are reported. Unfortunately, people on social media take the numbers from the very first day and post them everywhere. Many times, if you go back and check the stats again after a week, you might find different numbers. In fact, something similar happened to WUWA recently, when the reported number on the first day of the month was way lower than was actually later updated. So my point is that these numbers are not real, they are just estimates and nobody besides the developers knows the real numbers. For example, Honkai Impact 3 had an estimate revenue of $3.2 million across all servers in September. Now, this is in no way, shape or form the real number, but for the sake of it, let's try to calculate the PC revenue based on this number and see what the actual revenue for the month would look like. A while back, I ran a poll on YouTube and asked the Honkai Impact community what device they play the game on. I had over 2000 people respond to that poll, which is basically all the players on the global servers, and estimates are that 60% play on PC and around 40% play on mobile. Now, keep in mind that the poll I ran doesn't mean much since trends tend to differ between games and regions. For example, action games like Honkai Impact probably have a higher percentage of players on PC than mobile, while turn-based games like Star Rail probably have more mobile players than PC players. There's also the regional differences. In Asia, for example, mobile gaming is a lot more popular, while in the West people tend to prefer PC. But just for the fun, let's estimate the PC revenue based on the poll. I mean, it's just as valid as gacha revenue estimating Android revenue for the Chinese servers. So, if 40% of the players are on mobile, and mobile made $3.2 million, and given that 60% of the players are playing on PC, that should make the PC revenue somewhere around $4.8 million, bringing the total revenue across all platforms around $8 million. And keep in mind that gacha revenue is not the only source of money for these games. There are merchandise sales and other streams of revenue that a game can have. And while the $8 million we calculate is also an estimate, I just want to point out that nobody knows the real revenue of the game, but it's probably a lot higher than what we see on the gacha revenue chart. Now, does this mean that the gacha revenue chart and Sensor Tower are a complete waste of time and have no purpose? Absolutely not. While they do not show accurate numbers, they are good at showcasing trends around the game. For example, if you see the game's revenue growing a lot from month to month, you can safely assume that the real revenue is also rising and the game is doing well. The same applies the other way around. If you see the game's revenue declining, it means that most likely the real revenue is in decline and the game might not be doing as well. And this is exactly what's been happening with Honkai Impact Third ever since the end of part 1. Funnily enough, looking at the game's revenue over the years, it had quite a few moments of decline. For example, in 2019, the game had months where it was making around $20 million on mobile, and the first major dip can be seen at the beginning of 2020 when the PC client came out and many players most likely moved to PC, so their data wasn't recorded anymore. The next big revenue dip was around Genshin Impact's release, showcasing that Genshin did affect Honkai Impact Third as many players moved over or chose to spend on Genshin instead. There's no denying that Honkai Impact Third is an old game. This year the game turned 8 years old, which is a long time for a gacha game. The game's story was also one of the main reasons why people enjoyed it. So when Kiana's journey concluded in part 1, many people felt content to quit because for them the story also came to a close. Of course, we know that the story of Honkai Impact Third is actually far from over, but for many the end of part 1 was a natural stopping point. Another reason might be related to Star Rail. Yes, Star Rail may have directly contributed to Honkai Impact Third's decline. Whether intentional or not, HSR released around the same time part 1 ended, creating the perfect situation for some players to move over. Not only did part 1's story wrap up, but a newer Honkai game with a bigger budget, more advertising and more modern game systems was released, promising a fresh experience. It's difficult to say which factor had a larger impact, but there was a clear revenue dip after part 1 concluded. As a content creator, I can also attest that viewership after part 1 ended was much lower, up to 3 times lower than it was during the Elysian Realm and the Moon Arc eras. As I mentioned before, even Genshin Impact's launch affected Honkai Impact Third's revenue to some extent, so it's no surprise that every time a newer, more polished gacha game is released, Honkai Impact Third's revenue dips slightly as people are leaving. Many players feel burned out and want to try something new. It also doesn't help that some of Honkai Impact Third's systems feel very outdated. For example, the main game modes like Abyss and Memorial Arena still have a leaderboard system that not only promotes excessive power creep and fear of missing out, but also limits players' choice. To stay competitive, players must use the current best teams for each weather condition or risk being penalized. Modern gacha games don't have such a rigid system. So, another reason for the decline is that Honkai Impact Third follows an old formula for gacha games and many players have grown tired of it. This brings me to my next point: gacha oversaturation. This year has been fantastic for gacha games with new releases like Zenless Zone Zero and Wuthering Waves. But the problem now is that there are so many gacha games available and so little time in a person's day that they must pick and choose which game to play. A lot of players end up dropping older gachas to try new ones. This also makes it even less likely for new players to start Honkai Impact 3rd. Not only is Honkai Impact 3rd very unfriendly to new players, but there's little reason for them to pick it when there are so many other options. I remember when HSR and ZZZ hadn't launched yet, and Honkai Impact 3rd experienced a massive influx of new players from Genshin Impact who wanted to explore other MiHoYo games. While the new player experience was poor even then, there were no other alternatives for people to try. Nowadays, a Genshin Impact player is much more inclined to try out newer games with a better onboarding experience like HSR or ZZZ, and an HSR player is more likely to try Genshin Impact. So not only did old players leave, but the influx of new players was also reduced due to competition from newer titles. Even though HoYoverse tried to market Part 2 as a way for new players to get into the game, the issue is that Part 2 was still attached to an 8-year-old game. Don't get me wrong, I think that Part 2 did a lot of good things and improved the game significantly, modernizing many aspects that felt outdated, but it still wasn't enough to bring in a high influx of players. First of all, new players had to reach level 30 to start Part 2, and while Part 2 was initially presented as a good starting point for new players, everyone who played it quickly realized that wasn't the case. Part 2 relies heavily on information from Part 1, to the point where new players are almost certain to feel confused. On top of all the challenges that the game itself faces in attracting new players, the global server isn't helped by the fact that, unlike other HoYo games, Honkai Impact 3rd has more entry barriers. For example, the game still doesn't have an English dub to this day. I understand it's a lot of content and dubbing everything might not be feasible, but I feel like HoYoverse severely underestimates the importance of a dub. I know many Genshin and Star Rail players who refuse to try the game simply because it lacks English voice acting. Part 2 could have been the perfect opportunity to add it, even if only for Part 2 content. And before you say, Homu, but wouldn't it be weird to have part of the game dubbed while the rest isn't? I mean, yeah, but I've played games like that in the past, and it was fine. For example, a small game I enjoy in my free time called Eversoul recently added Japanese dub only to some parts of the game, even while it was previously only dubbed in Korean. And it works, it really doesn't bother me. Additionally, Honkai is available in far fewer languages than other HoYo games. Let me tell you, there's a big Spanish-speaking community interested in the game who have repeatedly asked HoYoverse to add a Spanish version. And I think people really underestimate how many countries in this world speak Spanish. And another major factor is that the game only features female playable characters. Now, I don't think this affects its popularity as much as the other points, but we can't deny that Honkai Impact 3rd misses out on an audience that the other modern games capitalize on, the husbando enjoyers. The point I'm trying to make here is that in addition to the game being massive, old and existing in a super saturated gacha space, it has a lot of entry barriers on the global side that the other games don't have because it comes from a different era of HoYoverse. And while I hope that some of these would be added with Part 2's release, it seems like HoYo didn't make a big effort to expand the game for its global audience. But despite everything I've mentioned, the situation with Honkai Impact 3rd is not as grim as some on social media make it out to be. As I said, the game still makes a lot of money, more than we see on the monthly gacha revenue charts, and contrary to popular belief, Part 2 might have brought in an increase of players rather than a decrease.
But Homu, the numbers don't lie. The game still makes the same amount of money as it did during Part 1.5, or even a little less. This shows there's no growing trend for the game. You dump Honkai Impact 3rd, chill.
First of all, rude, and second, my next point is about how comparing the revenue from Part 1 to Part 2 is not the best indicator of how things are due to the fact that the game has an almost entirely different monetization system and the spending habits that players had in Part 1 are not the same in Part 2. Before we get into the juicy stuff, let me explain the differences between the gacha systems of Part 1 and Part 2. First and foremost, the PT was reduced from 100 to 90. Second, the number of dupes required to reach SSS for a character was reduced from 8 to 6, which is in line with the other HoYo games. Now, on the gear side, things are a lot different. Perhaps most importantly, unlike before, all Part 2 stigmata are farmable. Yes, you heard me right. So, the only thing that you really need to pull for is the weapon, which is guaranteed to drop within 60 pulls. Previously, all the gear was locked behind gacha, with each piece having a PT of 50 pulls. This meant that if you were very unlucky, you could go up to 200 pulls to full gear a Valkyrie, whereas now you can be done in 60. And you may say,
okay, this is much better, right? What's the catch?
there are multiple. To offset these changes, Part 2 also added a dupe system for the weapons similar to Genshin and Star Rail, where you can pull 2 more copies of the weapon to upgrade its power. While these upgrades are not necessary, if you want the full potential of a weapon, you could go up to 180 pulls. Overall, I much prefer the Part 2 system because it's easier to get the gear, and the weapon upgrades are so minor that only super whales go for them, and let's be honest, it doesn't make a difference for them since they'll spend regardless. Another catch is that all the Part 2 stigmata can be crafted and upgraded with a new material called Source Prism, which, especially at the beginning of Part 2, was very scarce. Nowadays, HoYo does a much better job of distributing these mats to the point where I never feel like I'm lacking them. However, the issue is that the game locks you into constantly playing to get them, because many are tied to weeklies and limited time content, so you have to play consistently to get them. Another catch is that since Part 2 was released, each patch had a new S-rank Valkyrie locked behind gacha. Although there were back-to-back S-ranks in Part 2 as well, the usual norm was an S-rank patch followed by a farmable SP or A rank, or at least a farmable S-rank from the War Treasury. This made many players feel like they didn't have enough time to save crystals and breathe a little since they felt pressured to pull for every new unit to stay relevant in the meta, whereas previously they could use the SP Valk patch to save. Or did they? If we are talking pure math, even with back-to-back S ranks, Part 2 is still cheaper than Part 1 because the SP Valk's gear was not free. In Part 2 you need 90 pulls for the Valk and 60 more for the weapon. That's a total of 150 pulls per patch or 300 pulls over 2 patches if you are really unlucky. In Part 1 you needed 300 pulls just to get an S rank and its gear, and 120 more pulls to fully gear an SP Valkyrie. Not to mention that if you were a hardcore meta player, some SP gear was so powerful that you needed multiple copies. So even with all the changes, it's still much cheaper now than it was before. So why do people feel like they can catch a brat? Well, that's because the Part 1 gacha allowed you to snipe the weapon early. You see, a lot of players, especially those who weren't very competitive, which is most of the player base, would snipe the weapon early for both S ranks and SP units and stopped there. With the new system, it's very hard to do that, as most of the time you'll get close to PT before getting the weapon. And even though the chance to get the weapon is the same as before, Part 2 boosted the chance for stigmata to drop up to a whopping 14%, making it harder to pull the weapon even if the weapon rates remained the same. To sum it up, while the Part 2 gacha is unequivocally better on paper, Part 1 gacha allowed you to be lucky and snipe the weapon early and be done with it. Another issue is how the Part 2 Valkyries synergize with each other. For example, you had Senadina, Telema, Lantern and Songche all released one after another, and each being the best support for each other. So if you wanted to play these teams at full potential, you had to get all 4 of them. Sure, there are replacements like Hylia and Coralie that can fill in and cover the gaps, but the teams would suffer some damage loss. When Part 2 first released, it really felt like you needed to pull everything, partially because Part 2 introduced an entirely new mechanic, the Astral Ring, so I think that HoYo rushed a bit to fill in the roster as fast as they could. I felt the same at that time, but now that we have a good roster of characters and a clear idea of how Part 2 works, it's starting to show that not all Part 2 characters are made equal, and you can definitely skip some. For example, Lantern, Teresa and Sparkle are all characters that you can easily skip with minimal penalty. On the other hand, Selema, Songche and now Vita are much higher priorities and you'll feel their absence more if you don't have them. While it initially felt like you needed to pull every character, it's now clear that you can skip some Part 2 S ranks. And it's worth mentioning that Part 2 Valkyries have more value than Part 1 because each one functions as both a support and a DPS, while in Part 1 you needed 12 different units to cover all elemental and physical weathers, in Part 2 you only need 4. Yes, you heard me right, 4. With 4 units, you're covered for every possible weather except bleed. But hey, they have to shield Luna somehow. So even with the seemingly more aggressive release schedule, I think that the Part 2 gacha and units are miles better than what we had in Part 1. And it's not even close. And the only reason why people say that Part 1 was better is either because of anecdotal bias from bad luck, nostalgia, or simply because they do not fully understand how the game works. An example of this is how some people claim that Part 2 removed the PT system, which is not true. First of all, Honkai Impact always had a different PT system from other HoYo games, and unlike Genshin or HSR, your chances don't get astronomically boosted at soft PT. Additionally, more people are hitting hard PT in Part 2 because while the hard PT was reduced from 100 to 90, the soft PT stayed the same. This means that the chances of reaching 0 PT in Part 2 are the same as reaching 10 PT in Part 1. And because it's much easier to get characters and fully gear them, it's only natural that people will spend less money on the game, which I think also shows in the monthly revenue. That's why I said that it's unfair to compare the revenue from Part 1 to Part 2. If Part 2 had the same gacha system as before, revenue would likely be higher. Sure, the difference wouldn't be astronomical, but it doesn't really matter. And to prove that I'm not talking nonsense, I went on social media and asked the spenders in my community how the monetization changes from Part 1 to Part 2 affected their spending habits. And here are the results. Between spenders reaching out to me from my community and some friends, I managed to gather data from around 40 people. While I know that this isn't a huge sample size, there's a surprising overlap in responses, allowing us to identify some patterns, even if the numbers are not perfectly accurate. There are also a lot of interesting insights that I didn't even notice until reading what people had to say. So let's begin. First, the survey included spenders across different tiers. 30% were small spenders who usually spend less than $100 a month, 63% spent between $100 and $500 a month, and 7% spent over $500. 43% of people found themselves spending less since Part 2's release, while 30% say that they spend about the same, and only 26% say that they spend more, mostly due to bad luck. The majority, over 53%, agree that Part 2's gacha is a lot more forgiving for spenders, while 30% say that it's about the same and 16% think it's worse. A whopping 63% of people think it's easier to get a battlesuit and fully gear it in Part 2, while 27% think it's about the same and 10% think it's harder. The majority, 57%, prefer Part 2's gacha system over Part 1, 30% have no preference, and only 13% prefer Part 1. What this shows is that most active spenders are spending less since Part 2 started. The majority think that the Part 2 gacha is more forgiving for spenders, and agree it's easier to get a new battlesuit and fully gear it than before. Overall, most spenders prefer Part 2's monetization system over Part 1's. But if we dig deeper into the answers, we see some interesting patterns. For example, the people who spend the most don't notice a big difference in their spending habits between Part 1 and Part 2. This is because they go for weapon dupes and astral OPs, which results in them spending about the same. The groups that benefit the most from the Part 2 gacha system are light spenders and dolphins, who get every character and gear but do not go for anything extra. For these people, the Part 2 gacha system has greatly reduced their spending, while Leviathans still spend about the same, maybe a bit less. Of course, luck also plays a role. Some people wrote that while they understand that Part 2's gacha system is better on paper, they had terrible luck, so they ended up spending about the same, which I can relate to. Another interesting point is that a lot of people liked the off rates in Part 1 because they allowed them to work on building other Valkyries, while they feel that Stigmata dupes in Part 2 don't offer as much value. I partially agree with this and feel like they should make salvaging a Part 2 Stigmata give you 3 prisms instead of 1. Perhaps the most surprising finding was that most spenders are okay with the constant release of S ranks every patch as a way for HoYoverse to offset the cheaper gear and PT reduction. Instead, people cited that they didn't like the back-to-back releases of Valkyries that need each other in the same team, bringing up the Senna Thelema Lantern situation. Fortunately, this doesn't seem as much of a problem in recent patches, so hopefully it will stay that way. Some spenders, however, feel burned out with the constant releases and would appreciate a patch or two of break. Others mention that the constant power creep in Honkai Impact 3 makes them feel like they always need to spend, which is a problem many gacha games face. I've always said that power creep wouldn't be as big of an issue in Honkai Impact 3 if leaderboards weren't a thing. All gacha games have power creep. Even HSR has a lot, but the problem with Honkai Impact 3 is that it actively punishes you for not using the most optimal team. So, instead of using your favorite units, you're forced to use the meta. While older Valkyries can still clear content, since your score is compared against others for rewards, the power creep feels much more prominent. I agree that they should either give us some breathing spaces with farmable Valkyries in some patches, or remove the aspects of the game like leaderboards that punish players for not pulling every character. Genshin, Star Rail and ZZZ all have 5 stars and S ranks in every patch, sometimes even more than one, but players don't have an issue with those games because unlike Honkai Impact 3, those games don't punish you for skipping a character. So I think we can safely conclude that ever since Part 2 started, people spend less because the gacha is more forgiving, which also reflects in the revenue. That's why it's not fair to compare the revenue from the last year with today's. Looking only at Part 2 charts, Part 2 seems to have started strong, then dipped for a bit. For some reason revenue grew during Lantern's banner, then dipped again, reaching an all-time low during Terry's release. This is understandable given that Teresa isn't as meta-relevant as other units and was released between Songche and Vita, two very strong Part 2 units. Vita brought a huge revenue increase in China, almost equaling the release month, and I'm sure that the Honkai Star Rail collaboration will also do well. So, what's the conclusion of this video? Well, Honkai Impact 3 is not dead or dying, and I feel like people using these words have never played a game that was actually quote-unquote dead. There is still quite a substantial community for this game on social media, and the player base is still active. Sure, the game has definitely lost a part of its player base in the last year, there's no denying that, but if you consider the game's age, its newbie unfriendliness, the super saturated gacha market, and the fact that Kiana's story recently finished, I feel like it's something normal. This game will never be as popular as newer HoYoverse titles, no matter how many new stories HoYo creates or how much they improve the graphics and gameplay, simply due to the sheer amount of content it has that makes people more hesitant to pick it up, not to mention the barriers that the global version especially has for new players. That said, the game's decline has been overly exaggerated online by people for various reasons. The game's revenue on gacha revenue is not a good indicator of how much money it actually makes because it ignores PC revenue, merchandise, etc., and even on some mobile platforms it only estimates the sum. The game makes a lot more than what we see there, and for those comparing Part 2 revenue to Part 1, yes, revenue has declined, but not so much as it seems because Part 2 has a whole new monetization system that literally makes spenders, well, spend less due to how easy it is to fully gear a new unit. Judging by recent trends, Vita's banner did incredibly well, at least in China, as we don't have the global data at the time of the recording, but global usually follows the same pattern anyway. With the Honkai Star Rail collab following soon and the main story improving while introducing more Star Rail lore, the game will likely see an increase in both revenue and popularity in the coming months. Not to mention all the awesome quality of life changes we've been getting recently that truly improve the experience for existing players. All in all, Honkai Impact 3, while less popular, is already in the HoYoverse ecosystem, which guarantees that it will always attract new players from other HoYo games as long as the developers keep referencing it in the newer titles and connecting their lore in more obvious ways like they did recently in Chapter 5. Honkai Impact 3 is part of the Honkai series, which will only grow and become more popular as time goes on and new games are released, so it will always generate interest. And even so, Honkai Impact 3 doesn't need to really perform exceptionally well for HoYoverse. They make so much revenue from their newer titles that they can afford to fund new projects and keep the old ones alive and thriving without concern. This is evident in every update Honkai Impact 3 receives. Just look at the stark contrast between how the game looked and played at launch and how it is now. Just look at Rimu, the new map in 7.9. It's clear that the devs love this game and still want to keep developing it, otherwise they wouldn't bother making a part 2 or improving it as much as they could. For them, Honkai Impact 3 is more than a game, it's a time capsule that immortalizes how much they've grown and expanded over time.